fundamentals of hip training. When people start doing hip mobility, one of the first areas of focus is doing a hip CAR, a controlled articular rotation, meaning we are learning to move our hip independent of our pelvis and of our spine. And as we're doing the hip CAR, we're basically just exploring what range of motion do we actually have available currently in our hip. But what do we do if we don't know how to properly execute the hip CAR? Whether that means we don't know how to find our hip where we're looking for the right tissue engagement, whether we don't know how to reduce compensations from the spine or from the pelvis. We would do that by pulling apart the CAR into something called axial CARs, where we're learning how to rotate, which would be our fundamental function of our hip. So we're gonna break down the global hip CAR that is often prescribed into axial rotations, where we're learning to rotate on one axis basically. So starting with our flexion rotation, we want to make sure that we're not hiking at the pelvis, so we're not excessively going into flexion. If we don't have that range, you're going to feel that hike up. And you're going to just rotate your femur independently from your pelvis. And so as we externally rotate, we want to feel some contraction on our inner hip. And as we internally rotate, we want to feel a contraction on our outer hip. If we start to feel compensations from the pelvis hiking up, or from the low back extending, then we want to make sure that we're not exceeding what range of motion we actually have available to us. So we can do this in a standing position, or we can do this seated as well. Doing it seated may allow you to maintain a better positioning in your pelvis and keeping your core tight so that we don't overextend at the spine. Doing axial rotations for, say, a set of 10 from side to side would probably be a good way of you gaining some awareness as to how far does my hip actually rotate, and do we have ownership of the tissue that is shortening on each side. So as I internally rotate, my outer hip here is contracting, and as I externally rotate, my inner thigh is contracting. You may feel contributions to the movement in other portions of your hip, and that's okay. There's a lot of tissue that's revolved around making that movement actually happen, but doing this will be a way for us to gain a little bit more awareness so that when we go ahead and we do our hip CAR, we know that we're truly externally rotating, and then we know as we come around what internal rotation actually feels like. So after we get a sense of doing our flexion hip CAR, our flexion axial hip CAR, we would go ahead and practice doing it in abduction, more to our side like this. So we're working on that transition that we see through the global hip CAR, and we're just going to isolate external rotation out here, internal rotation to about there. External rotation as far as we can handle without adducting into front of us. Internal rotation to wherever we can manage. If we start feeling our pelvis hike up, we're exceeding our range of motion. So if I'm out here and my pelvis hikes up, I'm going to bring it down a little bit and maintain rotation through this zone. If I feel my spine extending, I'm going to try to reduce range of motion in whatever area I think that would result in reducing that compensation. So it's a very mindful practice as to how much is rotating from just our femur and not getting compensations. Another area that people lose themselves within the global hip CAR is not through this portion, sometimes this portion, but more often than not, the hip extension portion. So we went ahead and we established how much rotation do we have in hip flexion. We went ahead and established how much rotation do we have in abduction of our hip. And then we're establishing how much rotation do we have in hip extension with our leg under us. And so as our hip is in extension, you're gonna feel significantly more external rotation than internal rotation. That is where the zones of our hip actually tend to overlap. So when we're in hip flexion, we should be feeling more internal rotation rather than external. And when we're in hip extension, we should be feeling more external rotation rather than internal. A way to ensure that we're in full hip extension would be to tighten the stomach, keep the spine from extending. That's going to be the first area we see compensate. While my ribs are down and my core is braced, I'm going to bring my leg under me where I feel my glute and portions of my hamstring contracting. After I feel that contraction, I am looking to just find rotational workspace while I'm in hip extension. So I'm feeling my hip and my hamstring contract as I internally rotate my femur. and I feel portions of my hip contracting as I'm externally rotating my femur. And so we want to lock the pelvis down and have just the femur moving within the pelvis and no compensations coming from the pelvis itself, just like we did when we were doing our Flexion axial CARs and our Abduction axial CARs. When we're in hip extension, we're going to feel way more spine compensations as opposed to pelvic compensations. After we establish what range of motion, what joint workspace we have in flexion with internal and external rotation, and then in abduction, internal and external rotation, and then in hip extension, external and internal rotation. Go ahead and put all those pieces of the puzzle together so that we can more effectively execute our global hip CAR. After we turned our hip on with our various zones of axial CARs, we're gonna go ahead and do our global hip CAR with a block. This would be totally appropriate for somebody who has a hard time learning to separate their hip from their spine and their pelvis as they're going through the workspace that their hip has available to them. So after we did all of our axial rotations and trying to emphasize end range, as we go through our global hip CAR, I want to make sure that we are fully adducting our hip, thinking about bringing our femur across the midline of our body. Once we feel our inner thigh contracting, maintain external rotation of the femur as we come up. We're finding a contraction, a shortening of the inner thigh tissue there. We're maintaining that externally rotated position as I come out into abduction. I'm trying to maintain my ankle being inside my knee. Once I find that end range, I'm using my pole here to reduce compensation from the spine and ensuring that I don't pull away and get movement at the pelvis as a form of compensation there. So we have full external rotation. My core is tight with my ribs down, so my spine is not extending. I find full abduction with external rotation, and I begin internally rotating and not allowing my pelvis to hike up. And I'm trying to get my ankle outside of my knee as I go into full hip extension. I go in reverse by finding full hip extension. I feel my glute contracting. I abduct, feel my glute contracting at end range here. And then I begin externally rotating, and I'm pulling myself into the pole to reduce compensations from the surrounding structures. I'm in full external rotation, trying to keep my ankle within my knee, and I'm maintaining full hip flexion by driving my knee to my chest. I get full adduction and external rotation by finding the contraction on the inner thigh, and then I'm gonna begin that sequence with that same focus and intention as to squeezing what parts of the hip at end range throughout the range of motion. And again, using a pole like this is a very good way for us to reduce compensations as we say extend at the spine. Or if I'm doing my hip CAR like this, as I start abducting, I don't find myself rotating at the spine and pulling away. And so we can consider this like a training wheel for us and say putting a block here so that if I begin pulling away, I lose the block. And then as we get a little bit more afference, as we get a little bit more spatial awareness of our hip, we can begin doing freestanding hip CARs and reducing compensations without the training wheels on, so that we have a little bit more ownership of our hip without those constraints. From there, we would go ahead and explore what other positions can we be doing hip CARs in. And so we have a lot of different base positions that we can do these hip CARs that have different points of emphasis. So for example, if I'm in, say, the quadruped, the same goal applies, being that I want to create independent movement from my femur as opposed to having compensations at the pelvis and the low back. So as I'm in the quadruped, I'm going to flex my hip forward. I'm going to abduct my hip until I feel the end range contracting at my glute. And then our emphasis here would be internally rotating our femur as we come up into hip extension here. So we're going into hip extension. We're going to externally rotate our hip without extending at the spine or moving at the pelvis, and bringing our leg back under us. If we have a hard time not being aware of extending at the spine or hiking at the pelvis, we can use blocks to quite literally block ourselves and give ourselves a little bit of tactile feedback, and feeling the block shifting, especially through the rotational component, which tends to be the sticking point for most people. You may still feel some compensations as you go through this, but the objective is to just work on creating joint independence, especially through the rotational component there. The quadruped hip CAR is going to place emphasis on our hip in a different plane of motion rather than, say, the standing one or a sideline hip CAR, which is what we're going to go over next. So after we did our quadruped hip CAR, which is loading hip extension, we're going to do a sideline hip CAR as well. And so for the sideline hip CAR, we can go ahead and have a block for our heads so that we can go ahead and reduce compensations there as much as we can. For our hands, I just want to keep everything completely locked in stone. We want to reduce movement at the spine and at the pelvis. So whatever works for you to be able to keep it locked down. Some people hold a kettlebell, some people hold a dumbbell on the floor to anchor them down. So when we're in this setup, we're going to be using our top leg. You can do this with a knee bent position or with a straight leg position, depending on what we're trying to actually train. If we're in the knee bent position, we're going to go ahead and flex our hip. We're going to begin internally rotating as I bring my leg back into hip extension, and I'm trying to get my ankle higher than my knee, which would be full internal rotation of my femur there. I'm going to go back into hip extension. I'm going to start abducting my leg, bringing my knee to the roof, and I'm going to begin externally rotating my femur and trying to bring my ankle within my knee as I come up into hip flexion. I'm going to resume by going back into abduction and slowly internally rotating my femur and reducing as much compensation at the pelvis and the spine as possible. I'm again going into hip extension, and I'm trying to get my ankle higher than my knee by fully internally rotating through end range hip extension. I'm again going back into hip extension, squeezing my glute. I'm abducting my hip as I externally rotate and go into hip flexion as well. And as I said, we can do this with a straight leg or a knee bent position. If we're doing this in a straight leg position, I could externally rotate, trying to lock my knee and flex my quad. I can go ahead and abduct and begin internally rotating my hip as I go back into hip extension. And again, I'm internally rotated. I'm trying to bring my toes to the ground. I'm gonna extend and abduct my hip. Once I hit the end range there and I feel the contraction in my glute, I'm gonna begin externally rotating all the way around into hip flexion. We're trying to keep our knee as straight as we can. If we start feeling our knee bend a little bit, we're definitely gonna be exceeding how far into, say, flexion or hip extension we can maintain. So just like we can do a global CAR with our straight leg as a straight leg bias, we can do our axial CARs with a straight leg bias as well. And so for example, when we finish our deadlift range of motion, we're in full hip extension. If somebody has a hard time contracting their glutes in full hip extension and posterior pelvic tilt, one thing we can do is a straight leg axial CAR to develop internal awareness as to how does that tissue actually function and contributes to the end range of that movement. So with my knee fairly straight, I am externally rotating my hip, my femur, without any extension at the spine or movement at the pelvis, and then I'm internally rotating my hip as far as I can. Go ahead and externally rotate, trying to rotate my femur separately from my pelvis. Feel the glute contracting, and then internally rotate my hip separate from the pelvis and the spine. And so that's just another example as to how we can have a little bit more specificity to our training that would have carryover to our traditional weight training. For example, with myself, I have a harder time fully contracting my glute at the top of a deadlift, but when I go ahead and I do a straight leg axial CAR in hip extension, I have a harder time finding my glute as I fully externally rotate in this position. So for somebody in my position, the specificity of my internal training of firing my hips up is trying to find as much external rotation in my left hip as I can with my knee being straight, and then being able to transition to internal rotation as well. So when we can do our hip CARs in both a straight leg and a knee bent fashion, having our hip CAR done in a straight leg fashion versus a knee bent is gonna have a little bit more specificity to say when we're squatting and we're using our hips while in knee flexion, or if we're deadlifting or hinging while in hip extension with a straight knee. And so doing our internal training with a knee bent or a straight knee bias is going to have a little bit more specificity to when we're doing our traditional weight training that would be followed from our internal training.